Today, I want to do a little bit of time travel. Come join me for a second. This is the 2016 Steelers offense, and at the time, they were by far my favorite team to watch. I mean, this group is just straight up unfair. Let's take a look at who they've got. Oh yeah, remember that guy? It's Le'Veon Bell. He was arguably the best running back in the league at the time. The guy about to take the snap? Ben Roethlisberger, whose arm won him a Super Bowl ring. And then there's this guy, Antonio Brown, the receiver with the best numbers in the NFL, and it's not even close. With that kind of firepower, you just can't even hope to guard against all of it. And for that reason, you'd end up with plays just like this one.
Third game since he's returned. Second and 8, Roethlisberger loading up, going deep for Brown. Did he get the other one down? Yes! Antonio Brown, touchdown!
And now that you've seen that, jump forward with me. This is a very different picture of a very different situation. It's that same guy sitting out in Week 17 when his team needs him the most to get a victory just to try and barely squeak into the playoffs. He's not injured, he's suspended for personal conduct and abandoning the team, and he later requests a trade in the coming weeks. So why has Antonio Brown become so unhappy with the Steelers, the team that made him a household name and an unquestioned superstar? Well, it's a tough question, and NFL analysts will talk in circles for days about all the blame to go around for the Steelers' recent struggles. Mike Tomlin's lack of control, Le'Veon Bell's holdout, AB's tantrums, and they're not necessarily wrong either. The Steelers are in shambles in terms of their locker room. A pot of mismanagement that's been simmering for years was brought to a boil in the 2018 season. That Steelers offense I showed you from a few years ago is crumbling before our eyes. Le'Veon Bell is already out the door and will be on a new team next year. That much is already done. Today, I want to talk to you about the next piece that's likely to go, Antonio Brown, and how regardless of whoever you want to shoulder the blame for the team's dysfunctions, his personal unhappiness and demand for a trade from Pittsburgh is a result that stems almost entirely from his own sense of self-importance that's been inflating year after year ever since he emerged as a star. But before you post an angry comment, I understand to an extent AB's issues with the team in believing he deserves more respect, but none of that changes the fact that his behavior and actions have demonstrated how unloyal he can be in the name of his own personal success. And the kind of outbursts that AB has, they aren't anything new per se. Prima donnas have been around in the league for a while, and they're definitely entertaining, don't get me wrong. Guys like Chad Ochocinco and Terrell Owens were walking headlines when they were in their prime.
How's 35?
Man, they all suck, man. Come on, this me. It's me.
How's 35?
Horrible.
But while that might make for good television, it's a major problem for NFL teams, and it's becoming a big problem for the Steelers. It's a huge distraction from the focus of winning as a group, and when you mix in the fact that receivers grow to love their statistics more than getting those team wins, it can be a deadly combination in a locker room. This shift in mindset has become the reality for the generational talent that is Antonio Brown. So let's take a look at why he wants out of Pittsburgh and how his personality has become so toxic that he's damaging the Steelers big time with his off-the-field antics. So, I hate to do this to you, but we're going to have to time travel again, just for a little context. This here is young Antonio Brown, and he's got what a lot of superstars start out with, a chip on his shoulder. He was a walk-on at Central Michigan, and though he quickly became a record-breaking big fish in a small pond, draft scouts typically don't go easy on small guys from small schools, and Brown was no exception to the rule. He was called undersized at 5'10", 186 pounds, not strong enough, inconsistent in his routes and ball skills. Turns out, he was listening. There's a reason he's now considered one of the best wide receivers of all time, despite that billing as undersized. See, AB is obsessive about his craft, like few others at the position ever. It's what set him apart since the day he entered the league. He takes pride in his perfect technique and knowing his opponents so well that the only thing standing between him and making a play is just having the ball thrown to him. His workouts and preparation are unmatched, and no one can dispute that. Brown decided early on to start proving people wrong, and he hasn't stopped since. He started to reap the rewards pretty quickly, too. Of course, it was never going to hurt him that he had a Hall of Fame quarterback with one of the best deep balls in the entire NFL. Ben Roethlisberger and Brown would become a legendary duo in the years to come, as maybe one of the best connections that the league has ever seen. From early on, Antonio Brown was poised to break out, driven by his desire to be individually great, and he would soon go on a tear to make every possible accolade rain down from the sky to prove it.
Antonio Brown.
Antonio Brown.
Antonio Brown is
And then look at all the games
from
that we finished
Antonio
missed,
Brown.
and the guy still balls.
Brown had the unmistakable trajectory of a superstar, and he knew it. He grew himself into Antonio Brown, the brand, turning his personal statistics and success into his biggest point of pride, And in many ways, you can't blame him for that. All of the thousands of hours of work materialized into greatness, culminating in a player that was able to be flashy and have all the stats to back it up. By the time the 2017 offseason rolled around, Pittsburgh had seen more than enough. It was time to pay the man, and rightfully so. AB inked a contract for a 4-year, $68 million extension, making him the highest paid receiver in the league at the time. But this is where our feel-good story starts to change. It's been seen time and time again that when you give a player like Antonio Brown a massive contract, a guy who's a strong personality that's shown a propensity to focus on himself and get frustrated when things don't go his way, well, that can be a recipe for major instability. That contract served as validation to Antonio Brown that he was a key cog to the Steelers' organization and success. He was right up there with those in the coaching staff in his own perceived level of influence. I mean, he was getting paid more than all of them. And since the big money he strived for early in his career was now guaranteed in writing, he shifted his own focus to building his case for being the best receiver to play the game. He began to stop caring so much about being the best teammate possible, and those close to the team would later report that he'd show up late to team meetings 9 out of 10 times. His priorities were shifting. The 2017 season would be another massive success, cementing why he deserved his huge contract, but behind closed doors and underneath that success that had people campaigning to name Brown MVP, cracks that formed over years between him, Big Ben, and head coach Mike Tomlin were beginning to widen up. And that brings us here to this past season, what very well may be Antonio Brown's last year in Pittsburgh. In order to understand where everything's gone wrong, we need to look at what's been the Steelers' love triangle for many seasons now. In this corner over here, we've got Ben Roethlisberger. No doubt a great quarterback, but who has some issues with leadership and culpability off the playing field and in the locker room, often being the one who stokes the flame of controversy rather than extinguishing it as other great leaders do. In this corner, we've got Mike Tomlin, a player's coach who's kept the Steelers as a playoff contender year to year in spite of the constant feeling around the NFL that his permissive style has given players too much control, and recent struggles have given plausibility to that. Now, over the years, Tomlin and Roethlisberger have grown extremely close, as the two of them hold the reins to the Steelers' offense. However, while there were many a year where all were happy in Pittsburgh, there's another guy that inserted himself into the equation, and that's when things began to get complicated, in the same way that you'd find in a high schooler's romance novel. There he is, the ever-jealous Antonio Brown. Now, AB and Ben have been a duo ever since Brown emerged onto the scene, but their relationship has been strained over the course of the past few seasons' struggles and a more recent lack of connection between the two. With that said, Brown's relationship with Tomlin isn't much better. In fact, it's seen them drifting apart for the past few years, a culmination of personal disagreements and AB's insistence that his key role in the offense should give him more of a say for the team than Tomlin will allow. So coming into the year, things were already on rough waters, with shaky communication all the way around. And speaking of shaky communication, remember that star running back Le'Veon Bell the Steelers had? Well, to make matters worse, he didn't show up to training camp or for the start of the regular season as a result of a contract holdout. This was a distraction that would hang over the team like a storm cloud for nearly the whole year, and was very likely the cause of many of the early struggles that the team had at the start of the season. So things were going from bad to worse pretty quickly, and Antonio Brown's frustrations with the state of the team would show themselves in Week 2 with a major flare-up at the Steelers' new offensive coordinator on the sideline. And suddenly, everyone started to pay attention to how publicly unhappy AB was becoming fast. Why? Well, the Steelers' year was off to a slow start, but so was his. Despite having the ball thrown to him the second most times in the league through 3 weeks, he ranked 30th in yards, and didn't have a game where he eclipsed 100 until Week 5. And he wasn't able to directly change that, despite believing that he could. This was the first instance of AB taking coaches on head first, and it would only be a sign of what was to come. And just like the divas that have captivated media attention before, Brown started making his off-the-field actions just as notable as those on Sundays. Between tweeting that he wanted to be traded to threatening ESPN writers, it was clear there was a shift in AB's mindset. It was no longer him versus the teams coming up on the schedule. It was him versus the limitations he believed the Steelers were placing on his ability. What didn't help his attitude is that second-year Juju Smith-Schuster was quickly becoming a favorite target of Ben Roethlisberger, while Brown struggled compared to his past seasons. Smith-Schuster led the team in yardage through the entirety of the year, benefiting greatly from the extensive attention AB draws from opposing defenses. The Steelers even named Juju team MVP, a nod that would definitely rub AB the wrong way. The stress from having a downturn in production and constant disagreement with the coaching staff caused Antonio Brown to show his real number one priority, and despite his years with the organization, it was no longer the Pittsburgh Steelers. What I'm referring to would become the top reason to argue for why Brown isn't worth the high price tag and coaching headaches. And that's his actions in Week 17 of the 2018 regular season. Now, the Steelers had a season plagued with an inability to execute in key situations on both sides of the ball, and were now in a position where they needed to win and receive help from other teams just in order to make the playoffs. The real issues began that week with a dispute between Big Ben and AB at a team practice on the Wednesday leading up to their game against the Bengals, where Brown tossed a ball at his quarterback after feeling disrespected following drills. He left the practice from there, and he completely went off the grid, unreachable by staff and other players, and he would continue to miss the next 3 days of practices and team meetings all the way up until game day on Sunday, where he would show up to the stadium with the expectation to play. Despite his tantrum, he still felt untouchable as the best player on the team. When he was told that he was going to be suspended for his actions and sit for the game, he left the stadium at halftime without a word to his Steelers teammates. And this is where Antonio Brown stands headed into the 2019 offseason. A career Steeler and no doubt incredible playmaker, but one who's become so absorbed in his statistics and personal achievements that he's willing to abandon a team when they need him the most. Built up on years of being on top of the world, Brown's ego lives in a place where he has no trouble sleeping at night so long as he's leading the league in receiving yards. Team success be damned. And you can certainly make arguments for how poor of leaders Big Ben and Mike Tomlin have been in enabling AB to act like this for years, and how Brown can fit better with others. But the fact of the matter is, Antonio Brown is going to be hard-pressed to find a quarterback, coach, and an overall offensive scheme that are more able to fit with his playstyle and demanding personality. These outbursts of his are as big of a distraction to teams as a player like Odell Beckham or Chad Ochocinco before him, players who aren't satisfied if they aren't personally blowing up. And that attitude isn't going to change for AB in a different city with different scenery, and barring a major coaching intervention to check his ego, he's going to be a detriment to whatever locker room he's a part of in the years to come. So just like the old saying goes, the grass always appears greener on the other side of the fence. But for Antonio Brown, his ego and self-importance may very well act as poison to whatever field he ends up playing on.